Today we have a special program, and we're delighted to welcome to us to City Hall and to the City of Burlington the Reverend Nelson Johnson, who is presently, as I understand it, living in Richmond, Virginia, and who has spent a great deal of time in Greensboro, North Carolina. And Reverend Johnson is in Burlington today to help us commemorate the life and the death of Dr. Martin Luther King. And today is Friday the 15th, and he has just spoken at Burlington High School, made some excellent remarks there. And tonight he'll be speaking at a ceremony that we're going to have here at City Hall. So you will be watching this program 4 days after this series of events. What I wanted to do is, well, first, let me welcome Reverend Johnson to the City of Burlington.
Thank you.
I guess that the weather is a little bit different here than it is in Virginia.
It is the coldest place I've ever been in my life. To just be blunt about it.
And to the point that I'm trying to tell him that today is not cold. It's actually not bad. Yesterday was the cold day. Why don't we just start the discussion? Talk a little bit about the life of Martin Luther King Jr., what he stood for, how the media presents him to the public today, what's the relationship to the media presentation to the real man and his importance in American history?
Actually, I think one of the tragedies involved in the celebration is a tendency toward trying to distort the image of Dr. King such that it, in some sense, glorify the past, but justify the status quo. And by that, I mean that it's as if the job is done, and there are a lot of references to his statements, and many of them are out of context. And to my mind, the way that we need to think about Dr. King is less in terms of just statements that he made. Is to try to see the relationship of the man to the people and to his growing understanding of the causes that were responsible for the dehumanizing conditions of the people. And he started at one point, and he continually grew in his understanding, such that by the end of his life, he was very clear that the social structure of the United States, and I think he used the example once that we're charging for water, when the world is full of water. And while that might seem simplistic, he was really making a point that everything here is set up in such a way that people are overcharged for it, and that the means whereby people can become full persons economically and to relieve themselves of this kind of degradation, that it was not just an individual matter, that it was a matter deeply tied into the ideals and the social structure of the United States. And I think that point is being lost in our celebration of King.
And I think not by accident. I don't know, in fact, how many of the viewers fully understand how King was perceived in the last years of his life. Today there's a national holiday in his honor, and everybody in the world says, what a great man, da-da-da-da. And yet let's go back to the period, the last months of his life. I don't know that most viewers understand that for a number of years before he was assassinated, King was under intense scrutiny and investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and that in fact he was in the category of the equivalent of a Soviet spy. In other words, the kind of investigations that surrounded his activities, and the kind of phone tapping and the kind of pursuing was equivalent to somebody who was a known Soviet spy. He was considered to be, by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI of that time, to be a major enemy of the United States government. That's number one. And this is the man who 20 years later we have a national holiday in honor of. Why was that? Let's not forget that. Number two, at the time of his death, the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, regarded him as a tremendous political enemy. And Johnson, as we all recall, was quite a liberal in terms of great society programs and social programs. And yet, President Johnson considered Martin Luther King to be a very strong political opponent. No love lost between the two. The national media was not very kind to King in the last few years of his life. Let me throw out to you why. Why was that? Why was that? Why was a man who today is regarded by everybody from the extreme right wing and Ronald Reagan as a great American, why was this quote-unquote great American under intense investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation? Why was the President of the United States considering him to be an enemy of the government?
I think some of it is obvious on the surface, and the surface is the surface, that King's position, for example, on the war in Vietnam, he had been against it for some time, but he hadn't come out against it. And he came out against it in, I believe, 1967. He was roundly criticized. I remember the press secretary for Lyndon Johnson was Carl Rowan. And Carl Rowan used to be on television every day, pretty much denouncing the man and driving this wedge between civil rights, hurting the civil rights movement. I think that's the kind of phraseology that came out, and that you ought to stick to civil rights and you ought not to get into international stuff. And King gave the kind of answer that was characteristic of a man with that kind of insight and passion. And he gave it, I remember him giving it in a speech in which he said that for some 12 years now, I've been working and struggling for integration. And at this point in my life, I'm being asked by the President to segregate my consciousness and to say that I can stand and look at the killing of people in Vietnam, and that doesn't matter when I'm, representing the opposite of that in the United States. So you can see right away that he was against the entire foreign policy, but to my mind, a deeper development was occurring. King was gradually becoming a bridge between a number of movements in this country. I think the anti-war movement, the youth movement, the progressive left and white movement, and he couldn't be at that point dislodged from the Black Liberation Movement because of his style, his strength, his roots, and all of this. And he was also becoming increasingly clear that the arena of struggle was moving from breaking down barriers, such as desegregation and so forth, to challenging those structures that were denying the economic means to life for people. That's what he was doing. So when you put those things together, and in his position and with his clout and authority, it becomes fairly obvious that those who opposed those policies took him very seriously. And David Garrett wrote a book which outlined numerous details of the FBI sending women to the man and all kinds of stuff.
I mean, before we go any further and broaden this discussion, what people should know is that his phone was tapped, and they all knew it. It was no great secret. Tape recordings of personal aspects of his life were threatened to be released to the media. The FBI on a regular basis was leaking lies and information to the media, trying to discredit him on a personal level. And that was the kind of campaign that was being waged against him. I think the point that you're making, which I really agree with, is that as he was broadening his scope, what he was also understanding is that to a certain degree, the struggle for justice was a multiracial struggle. And that in fact, at the end of his life, as you'll recall, and I know as you spoke about at the high school, he was, as viewers will recall, he was organizing a Poor People's March on Washington, which is going to be a multiracial demonstration of poor people and of working people. And I think what he was increasingly understanding was that it was one thing to integrate lunch counters in the South, or schools, or checklists for voting rights, which is enormously important. But it was another whole thing to be talking about decent jobs and decent housing, decent educational opportunities, which in fact would cost the government tens of billions of dollars, or issues of war and peace.
I wanted to accent another point of King's life, and we look at the man largely in terms of what's available to us in terms of outside imagery, speeches, etc. I like to raise the question of trying to get in touch with what moved him, what pushed him, and and it's important to see that it really took something to over and over again confront the nastiness of racism in the South, day in and day out, to be harangued and spied upon, and to still call for the lifting up of the very best in humanity. Okay? How do you put that together? Because that generally leads to a reaction to that, eye for an eye, type of a thing. I think the man was really driven by a profound understanding of human beings and a love for them, okay, that went beyond superficially what they did on the surface to recognizing something deeper and more basic in them, that he truly believed that creative work would give rise to. Now, one of the points that I have a little concern with now is how we interpret what he did. King recognized that you had to have love and power, and that they were not in contradiction to each other necessarily. So economic boycott and this Poor People's March was in effect, and it was a conscious plan to disrupt the normal operations of the government, which is a form of power, And he was willing to do that, not because he liked disruption, but because he loved the people. And that one we can never let loose of, otherwise we lose hold to who King was. And I just wanted to emphasize that point for our audience. In connection with that, let me just say this before I let this point go. I'm really disturbed about how he's being trapped into a single principle or a single statement, and you have no sense of the man when you say he was mainly nonviolent. Okay, he was thoroughly, authentically, fully pro-human and willing to search for new ways to do things in order to move toward the realization of the full human person. You can't trap him into any one tactic or any one simple principle.
I remember something, I think it was a point that he made when we talked about violence. And he was a man, of course, who believed in Gandhian principles of nonviolence. But when you talk about violence, and he made this point often, you don't have to do something violent. I don't have to hit you over the head to be violent or to do violence to you. The society does violence to people when they are hungry, when children are uneducated, when people, very quietly, no one has to do anything, but if they lack health care and they die at an age when they should not be dying, or when in the world that we live in today, millions of people today, very quietly, no front page stories today, are dying of starvation. That is violence. And I think that was the point, one of the points that he made. Violence, in a sense, is going on all around us. And as you point out, he was many things. As you mentioned in your speech to the high school students today, a very, very brilliant tactician, very creative in terms of developing tactics to lead the struggle forward. But that's one point that I want to reiterate about violence. You don't have to do something to somebody to do something violent. Sometimes not doing anything, allowing people to suffer and to die very quietly is an act of violence. And I think what you're saying is that given that reality, he felt the passion to keep going forward to change that type of situation.
Education today is one of those critical areas that we can define as violence. I don't know how aware people are in this area. There's a general need to revamp our educational system generally. But when we try to claim King spirit, okay, and that is kind of this drive and this desire and this passion for the well-being of persons that will take you against the social structure if you have to do it, because it's not sacred, the people are. That we have a situation, if you take that kind of spirit and you look in the inner cities where we're losing 60 to 70% of high school students, and I'm using we here and to mean black people. It's also happening to other people as well, but I'm more familiar with that. And in the context of a society like this with unemployment and underemployment, there's virtually no chance for a meaningful life. And so in effect, these people are being dismissed as societal waste. Okay? That's the statement that is being made. Now that's totally incompatible with the spirit of King. And any of us who claim that spirit cannot be silent in a context like this. And you could apply that across the board to homeless people and to the tragedies that we have at least in part helped precipitate in Israel, with the killing of the Palestinians in the Philippines, in Central America, to be sure. All of this is what we have to come to terms with if we are true to claiming the spirit of King instead of getting caught up in rhetoric about him.
You're making a point that I think is not made often enough. You know, the media operates in funny ways. They like to get onto new issues, right? And, you know, things are supposed to be new this year. And, you know, 10 or 20 years ago, you couldn't pick up the newspaper without another story about what's happening in the ghetto or this, that, and the other. So I guess the media or the country got bored with the issue. So we very rarely, in the national media now, hear what's happening in the ghettos throughout this country. But, and maybe you can go into this a little bit, my impression is that for the average black kid in the ghettos of America, the situation today is dismal, perhaps worse than ever was in terms of kids not graduating school, not having jobs, getting involved in drugs or other self-destructive type activities.
The statistics are clear, it's absolutely worse. There are no jobs out here for many people, and you have deregulation, spontaneous restructuring of the economy, or whatever people choose to call it. But in effect, millions of people outside of the statistical count, you know, that's what I call societal waste. They're not counted anymore. And then many people who are counted are making such low wages. There's just no way that you can live on $3.50, you know, and that you have huge sectors of the community trapped into that. And that's a direct outgrowth of policy decisions, you know, that's kind of inherent in the social structure itself. And we have to address that, and I imagine that local communities are addressing it in ways that they can, but they can never address it sufficiently until they are tied together and that a greater impact is made on national policy.
Well, we have, ironically, a very similar problem here in our state and our area. We have a very low unemployment rate, 2 or 3%. But the wages that many of our workers are earning are abysmal. Mm-hmm. They're not minimum wage, primarily lately because the need of employers to attract employees has forced them to raise wages. But the wages are very low, and what we're seeing now is, in many instances, husbands and wives having to go out to work in order to bring home an income that can take care of the family. Let me change the subject, and not that I want to bestow upon you leadership of the entire population of black people in the United States of America.
I wouldn't dare accept it.
But I did, what is the political attitude of the black community that you perceive now? Is Jackson is there a lot of excitement about Jackson's campaign for president?
There's certainly some excitement about Jackson. I don't think there's quite as much as there was in 1984. but I think overwhelmingly blacks, and particularly grassroots blacks, will vote for Jackson. And to the extent that they are organized and their organizations are facilitated, will work for them. I do think, though, that there is a deeper discussion and thinking going on in the black community now. I mentioned education. I know people who are very political, and they're carving out niches of things that they're trying to work on. And we're beginning to see pieces of work developed. But by and large, the black community has a lot to do in the next few years to impact the negative social reality that we're now experiencing. I think Jackson is a positive force in that, but the critical issue is how well the organization is built in the process of the presidential campaign, and what can continue after some folk are elected to Congress and to the state houses and perhaps to the presidency.
You know, it's funny. I think perhaps, maybe I'm wrong on this, but perhaps the first glimpse that some of us have had about the impact of black participation and involvement in politics in the South was with the Bork nomination.
Yes.
And it was so, to me, it was incredible to turn on the television and see these 60 or 65-year-old white politicians who have been bred in a segregated South, who fought for a segregated South, getting on television saying how they couldn't support the nomination of Judge Bork because he didn't believe in racial equality. It was one of the funniest things that I've ever seen. And it was very clear that they now understand, at least, that in the South, blacks are voting, they're participating in politics, and that it was good politics for them, obviously. I'm sure they did their polls. And you've begun to see some of the changes that voter registration drives and participation of blacks in politics in the South has brought. True?
Definitely, definitely. It's interesting. There's an interesting way to look at movement, and to some extent, Bork not being seated maintained the status quo. Okay, it was an advance only against the possibility of a greater negative, and that's very significant, particularly when negatives are reality, in this world. So you can't diminish it at all. What I think is necessary now is to try to figure out how to more creatively use that political power to advance leverage, if you will, more progressive forward motion in the community. And I think that has to do both with coalition building. I think it has to do with strong leadership on the local level. I think a number of factors. I think the Jesse Jackson campaign is stimulating at least that kind of discussion. I think it's helpful in that.
I don't know if you were there. I was to the first convention of the Rainbow Coalition in Washington. Did you happen to be there?
No, I wasn't.
And it was the formal founding of the Rainbow Coalition. Right. Very impressive. It was in Jackson, everybody, you can criticize anybody, because nobody is perfect, including Jesse Jackson, by no means. But what was very impressive at that meeting is, if you talk about the need to build coalitions, to bring together the disenfranchised people of this country, to begin to claim the reality that they are the majority of the people. I think, obviously, the tragedy in this country is you have a small number of people with incredible wealth and incredible power who determine policy. Half the people don't vote at all. The rest of them respond, many people respond to the 30-second TV ads. And what I think you and I would agree on is that outside in the streets all over this country, there are tens and tens of millions of people who have a commonality of interests. Whether you're black or white or green or yellow, you want decent health care, you want decent educational opportunities for your kids, you want decent jobs, you want decent retirement benefits. You don't want to be spending your money killing the people in Nicaragua when we can improve the environment in our own country. Everybody, vast majority of people agree on these principles. And what was very exciting to me in seeing this coming together of the Rainbow Coalition, really good people from all over the country. Some farmers from the Midwest who are fighting to preserve their farms. and some of the best people in the labor movement who are fighting to see that their decent paying jobs are not turned into minimum wage jobs.
Mhm.
And people, you know, from the black communities all over the country, and some good government leaders. Very exciting. Do you see the Rainbow Coalition as one possible mechanism by which we could have some political clout in this country?
Oh, I think it's definitely one of those mechanisms. I think we need to do a lot to strengthen it in as many ways as we can. In the South and all over the country, I'm more familiar with the South, North Carolina, where I'm working with the Rainbow Coalition there. But just the concept itself is very powerful. I think Jackson talks about a kind of cultural quilt, the weaving and his genius for putting together creative phrases, kind of weaving together this diversity in such a way that the diversity is not conflict, but in fact beauty and strength. Okay? And that new possibilities began to emerge, and I think he's made a very valuable contribution in that. I think the challenge before us is how to put into place or to strengthen already in place leadership within the Rainbow on the local level, such as ensure its continuity and growth.
Right. Is there much white participation in the Rainbow Coalition in, say, North Carolina, or is it mostly black?
There's a considerable amount of white participation in the South. It's up quite a bit from 1984. And in fact, there's a southern caucus of whites whose primary responsibility is to try to figure out how to penetrate and to work with the somewhat natural constituencies of Jesse Jackson. By natural constituents, I mean people who, if they would look at it carefully, would see that their interests are served and are somewhat open to looking at it. But the amount of work and thinking and strategizing that's necessary to reach those sectors of the society, while it might not be what it could be, it's growing, and several organizers are working primarily on that.
Good. Okay, I think unfortunately we're coming to the end of our half hour, and discussing that in case we have 2 minutes to go. Okay. I think one can go on for hours and hours discussing the life of King from a dozen different points of view. Just the man himself and his courage and his intelligence. And what we were talking about before the program. Here's a guy who could have at any time along the process have stopped and said to the establishment, look at what I've done, look at what I've accomplished, and gotten the money and the praise and have ended his life at that point. But the guy kept going, never stopped. He kept going, growing, and keep moving forward. And that's just, let me mention, if I might give a plug, I didn't write this book, but it's, maybe Nelson, you have some other books. There's a wonderful book that I read a few months ago. It's called Let the Trumpet Sound, The Life of Martin Luther King Jr. by Stephen Oates, which is one excellent biography, which really gives you an inkling of the man as a man. Do some other books come to your mind that viewers might be interested in?
Well, I highly recommend that one. For people who want to take a look at FBI activity and the kind of web of conspiratorial stuff going on around King, David Garrett's King and the FBI, I would highly recommend. It's well researched, lots of facts and figures, and they will make that picture very vivid too.
Okay, I think with that, we're probably running out of time. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to welcome you to the city of Burlington. We hope you'll come back again. It's not always this cold. It's only about 10 months a year. July it warms up a little bit.
I look forward to coming back in July.
Okay, and we'll see you next week.